No one chooses which family to be born into, especially when your last name is Trump and your father is one of the most controversial presidents in United States history. Barron always understood this, but never spoke about it aloud. At 16, he had learned to maintain his composure in front of cameras and respond with rehearsed phrases to reporters' repetitive questions. Yes, I'm proud of my father. No, I'm not planning to go into politics yet. Studies are going well, thank you for asking. But on this rainy Tuesday, everything was about to change. Barron sat in the back row of his history class at St. Andrew's School, absently staring out the window at Maryland's gray sky. Mr. Parker, the teacher, was enthusiastically lecturing about the Civil War, but the young man's thoughts were elsewhere. In 3 days, he was scheduled to deliver a speech at a charity gala, another mandatory event where he was expected to display perfect behavior and say all the right things. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the piercing sound of the fire alarm. The class erupted in noise as everyone began to rise from their seats, but Mr. Parker called for order. Calm down, everyone. Let's exit in an orderly fashion, just like in our drills. Barron was already heading toward the door with the others when he heard soft crying from under a desk in the corner of the classroom. There sat Sarah Chen, a quiet, autistic girl who had recently transferred to their school. She was covering her ears with her hands and rocking back and forth, clearly terrified by the loud siren. The Secret Service agents, who constantly shadowed Barron, were already rushing to escort him out of the building. But he did something no one expected. He stopped. "Mr. Thompson, give me a minute," he said firmly to the lead agent, who was already reaching out to grab his shoulder. Kneeling beside Sarah, Barron spoke softly. "Hey, it's okay. I know the sound is very loud and scary, but we need to get out of here. Can I help you?" Sarah continued rocking, not lifting her eyes. The agents were growing anxious as smoke began seeping into the corridor. As they would later learn, a fire had started in the chemistry lab 1 floor below. Barron reached into his pocket and pulled out his headphones, expensive ones with active noise cancellation. He always carried them because sometimes the noise of crowds and cameras became unbearable. Carefully, trying not to frighten the girl further, he placed them over her ears. There, that's better, right? "Let me help you up," he said, extending his hand. For the first time, Sarah looked up at him. Her eyes were red from crying, but the panic was starting to subside. Slowly, she took his hand. The Secret Service agents were practically bouncing with anxiety, but Barron remained calm. He helped Sarah to her feet and, still holding her hand, led her toward the exit. The rest of the class had already evacuated, leaving them among the last people in the building. As they made their way through the smoke-filled corridor, Barron could feel Sarah's hand trembling in his. The Secret Service agents formed a protective circle around them, but for once, Barron wasn't thinking about his own safety. His only concern was getting Sarah out safely. They could hear the crackling of flames from below, and the smoke was getting thicker. Sarah stumbled, and without hesitation, Barron scooped her up in his arms. Despite being tall for his age, he wasn't particularly strong, but adrenaline gave him the strength he needed. "Almost there," he reassured her, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Keep your eyes closed and just breathe slowly." As they emerged from the building into the rainy afternoon, a crowd of students, teachers, and emergency responders turned to stare. Someone started clapping, and soon the entire crowd joined in. But Barron ignored them all, focusing instead on getting Sarah to the waiting paramedics. Only after the medical team had checked both of them for smoke inhalation and Sarah had been reunited with her panicked parents, did Barron allow himself to sit down on the back of an ambulance, his shoulders sagging with exhaustion. That was quite something, Mr. Trump," said Mr. Thompson, the lead Secret Service agent. His usual stern expression softened slightly. "Though I must say, you gave us quite a scare." Barron just nodded, watching as Sarah's mother hugged her daughter tightly. The expensive headphones were still perched on Sarah's ears, but he had no intention of asking for them back. By nightfall, the story had spread across social media and news outlets. Videos taken by students showed Barron's calm rescue, and suddenly he was being hailed as a hero. But unlike the carefully choreographed public appearances he was used to, this felt different. Real. The next morning, as he walked into school, after the all-clear had been given for students to return, something had changed. The usual whispers and stares that followed him were different now. Instead of "That's Trump's son," he heard, "That's the guy who saved Sarah." During lunch break, he was surprised when Sarah approached his table, holding his headphones. Her mother stood nearby, watching proudly as her daughter, who usually struggled with social interactions, took this brave step. "Thank you," Sarah said quietly, holding out the headphones. "But can you show me how to use them? The noise, like it's always too much." Barron smiled, pushing the headphones back toward her. "Keep them. I have another pair. But I'll show you all the features. There's this great noise-canceling setting that really helps when things get overwhelming." As he demonstrated the headphones' functions to Sarah, explaining each feature with patience and understanding, other students gathered around, not to gawk at the president's son, but to listen and learn. Some even shared their own experiences with anxiety and sensory overload. For the first time in his life, Barron felt seen for who he was, not just for his last name. The incident had cracked the carefully maintained facade he'd built over the years, revealing something more genuine underneath. That evening, as he sat in his room preparing for the upcoming charity gala speech, he made a decision. He completely rewrote his prepared remarks, replacing the standard platitudes with something more personal. He would talk about understanding, about seeing past labels and assumptions, about the quiet battles people fight every day. The night of the charity gala arrived, and Barron stood at the podium, looking out over a sea of expensive evening wear and expectant faces. The event was raising money for children with special needs, and suddenly, the coincidence seemed almost too perfect. Taking a deep breath, he set aside his note cards and began to speak. "3 days ago, I learned something that no amount of private education or political grooming could have taught me," he started, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply be yourself, even when the world expects you to be someone else." The room fell silent as he shared the story of the fire and Sarah, not as a tale of heroism, but as a moment of human connection. He spoke about the daily challenges faced by people like Sarah, about the courage it takes to navigate a world that often feels too loud, too bright, too overwhelming. "We talk about inclusion," he continued, "but real inclusion isn't just about ramps and special programs. It's about understanding. It's about seeing people for who they are, not who we expect them to be. I've spent my entire life being seen as Trump's son first and Barron second. Sarah helped me understand what it feels like to be defined by something beyond your control." In the audience, several people were wiping away tears. Even the hardened political operatives, who had come expecting another polished performance from the Trump heir, were caught off guard by his raw honesty. "So yes, this gala is about raising money, and that's important. But it's also about changing how we see each other. Because sometimes the person who needs help might look like they have everything figured out, and sometimes the person who helps you might be the one you least expect." The applause that followed was deafening, but it wasn't the polite, measured clapping of political events. It was genuine, emotional, real. In the days that followed, Barron's speech went viral, but not in the usual political way. It resonated with people across the political spectrum, with parents of special needs, children, with teenagers struggling to forge their own identities in the shadow of family expectations. Sarah's parents reached out, asking if Barron would be interested in helping them start a program at St. Andrews for students with sensory processing issues. Without hesitation, he agreed, using his platform to raise awareness and funds. The program, which they named Quiet Space, began small, just a room equipped with noise-canceling headphones, dimmed lights, and comfortable seating. But it quickly grew into something more. Students who had never felt comfortable in the traditional school environment found a place where they could decompress, study, and just be themselves. Barron became a regular visitor to the Quiet Space, not as a patron or figurehead, but as someone who understood the need for occasional escape from the world's constant noise. He would often sit there during lunch breaks, sometimes helping younger students with their homework, sometimes just sharing comfortable silence with others who understood. The media, always eager for stories about the Trump family, tried to spin various narratives about Barron's involvement. Some praised it as brilliant political positioning for a future campaign. Others criticized it as an attempt to distance himself from his family's legacy. But for once, Barron didn't care about the headlines. 1 year later, Barron stood in the expanded Quiet Space facility at St. Andrews, now a model program that schools across the country were beginning to emulate. The room had grown to include several separate areas, a study space, a relaxation zone, and even a small sensory garden that students had helped design. Sarah, now more confident in serving as one of the program's student ambassadors, was showing a group of visiting educators around the facility. Barron watched from the background, a small smile playing on his lips as he remembered the frightened girl from that day in the fire. Mr. Trump, a voice called softly. He turned to find a reporter from a major network who had been covering the program's one-year anniversary. Can I ask you something off the record? Barron nodded, expecting another question about his political aspirations or his father's latest controversial statement. My daughter was diagnosed with autism last month, the reporter said, her professional demeanor cracking slightly. She's struggling in school, and I'm terrified for her future. How, how did you know what to do that day with Sarah? For a moment, Barron was quiet, considering his response. I didn't, he finally admitted. I just knew what it felt like to be overwhelmed, to have everyone watching you, expecting things from you. Sometimes the best thing you can do is just be there, be quiet, and let someone know they're not alone. The reporter nodded, wiping away a tear. You know, when I was assigned this story, I expected to write about privilege and politics, but this isn't about that at all, is it? No, Barron smiled. It's about being human. Later that evening, as he walked through the school's empty halls, Barron passed by his old history classroom. Mr. Parker was still there, grading papers. The teacher said, looking up. When you first started here, everyone wondered how we should treat you. The son of a president, all that security, all that attention. We were so focused on what made you different that we almost missed what makes you special. Barron paused in the doorway. And what's that? Your ability to see past differences, to understand that everyone, regardless of their background or challenges, just wants to be seen for who they are. As Barron drove home that evening, his Secret Service detail following discreetly behind, he thought about how much had changed in a year. The Quiet Space program was expanding to other schools, and he had found his voice, not as a Trump, but as himself. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Thank you for the new headphones. They're helping Tommy with his first day in the program. Tommy was a freshman who had been on the verge of dropping out due to severe anxiety before finding the Quiet Space. He was just one of many students whose lives had been touched by the program. The next morning's newspaper would carry a story about the program's success, with quotes from educators, parents, and students. But the most powerful quote came from an anonymous student. In the Quiet Space, nobody cares who your parents are or what makes you different. We're all just trying to find our way through the noise. Barron kept that newspaper clipping, not because it mentioned him, but because it captured exactly what he had hoped to create. A place where labels didn't matter, where being yourself was enough. And perhaps that was his real legacy, far more meaningful than any political ambition or family name. The understanding that sometimes the quietest actions speak the loudest, and that true strength lies not in power or privilege, but in the ability to see and accept others exactly as they are.